The champagne glass trembled in my father's weathered hand as General Patricia Hayes stepped up to the podium at Riverside Country Club. The room fell silent except for the soft clink of crystal and the rustle of dress uniforms. Frank Romano, my father, had been bragging to anyone who'd listen about his invitation to this exclusive military retirement ceremony, though he'd conveniently left out how he'd gotten it. His voice had been loud and confident all evening, regaling strangers with stories about his auto shop and his opinions on how the military had gone soft these days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But now, as the general began to speak about extraordinary service and uncommon valor, something shifted in the air. I watched from across the room as my father's expression changed from smug satisfaction to confusion, then to something I'd never seen before. The general was looking directly at our table, her steel-gray eyes fixed on someone sitting right next to him. My father turned to follow her gaze, and for the first time in 28 years Frank Romano was speechless. "I'm Valerie Romano, though everyone who matters calls me Major Romano now." This is the story of how a mechanic's daughter who was told she'd never amount to anything became the woman a three-star general saluted in front of 200 of the military's most distinguished officers. But more than that, this is about the moment my father finally understood what he'd been looking at all those years when he saw me and chose to see nothing instead. The sound of my father's voice still echoes in my mind from that humid August evening 8 years ago. I was 20 years old, fresh out of community college with an associate degree in engineering, and I'd just told him about my decision to enlist in the Army. We were standing in Romano's auto shop on the outskirts of Millbrook, Ohio, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal shavings that had defined my childhood. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across my father's face as he wiped his greasy hands on a red shop rag that had seen better days. The Army. Frank Romano's laugh was sharp and bitter, cutting through the thick summer air like the sound of grinding brake pads. "Val, sweetheart, you can barely change a tire without asking for help. What makes you think they'd want someone like you?" I stood there in my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for my college graduation that he hadn't attended, feeling smaller than I had since I was 12 years old. The graduation ceremony had been on a Tuesday afternoon, and he'd said the shop was too busy to close early. Mrs. Henderson from next door had driven me instead, taking pictures with her old digital camera and treating me to dinner at Applebee's afterward. She'd hung those pictures on her refrigerator with more pride than my own father had ever shown for any of my accomplishments. "I got accepted into officer candidate school," I said quietly, holding the acceptance letter I'd been carrying around for 3 days waiting for the right moment to share the news. "They're offering me a chance to specialize in combat engineering. With my degree and test scores I could be leading teams, making real decisions, doing something that matters." Frank snorted, tossing the rag onto his workbench where it landed next to a stack of unpaid invoices and empty beer bottles from his lunch break. "Val, honey, officers are leaders. They're people others look up to and respect. You've got to be realistic about who you are and what you're capable of. Your mother, God rest her soul, she had these big dreams too. Look where that got her." The mention of my mother hit like a physical blow. Elena Romano had died in a car accident when I was 15, but before that, she'd been the one who encouraged my love of math and science. She'd helped me build model bridges in our kitchen, teaching me about load distribution and structural integrity while Frank watched football in the next room. She'd been the one who said I could be anything I wanted to be, who drove me to academic competitions and science fairs, who filled out my college applications when I was too overwhelmed to finish them myself. "Mom believed in me," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "She said I had potential." "Your mother was a dreamer," Frank replied, his voice softening slightly but his words cutting deeper because of it, "and I loved her for it, but dreams don't pay the bills or keep a roof over your head. This shop, this business I built with these 2 hands, this is what puts food on our table. The military isn't going to see what I see when I look at you, Val. They're going to see a small-town girl who's in over her head." He turned back to the engine he'd been working on, dismissing me with the gesture. "You want my advice? Get a job at the bank downtown or maybe the insurance office. Something stable, something safe. Marriage to a nice local boy wouldn't hurt either. Leave the hero stuff to people who are built for it." The garage fell silent except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of traffic on Route 3. I folded the acceptance letter carefully and put it back in my purse, my hands steady even though my heart was racing. Marcus, my younger brother, appeared in the doorway leading to our apartment above the shop. At 17 he was already taller than Frank and had started helping in the garage after school. He'd heard everything, I could tell by the way his jaw was set and his hands clenched at his side. "Dad," Marcus started, but I shook my head. This was between Frank and me, and I needed to handle it myself. I leave for basic training in 6 weeks, I said calmly, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I've already signed the paperwork and taken the oath. I'm not asking for your permission or your approval, I'm telling you what's going to happen.
Oh.
Frank straightened up so quickly he banged his head on the hood of the Chevy he'd been working under. The hell you are, I won't have you throwing your life away on some fantasy about being G.I. Jane. You're staying right here where you belong. Where I belong. The words came out louder than I'd intended, and I saw Marcus step further into the garage, ready to intervene if needed. Frank, where exactly do I belong? Because in 20 years of living in this house, you've never once you've told me what I'm not good at, what I can't do, what I shouldn't try, but you've never once told me what you think I'm actually capable of. Don't you dare talk to me like that, I'm your father, and I know what's best for you. This family has been through enough, and I won't watch you destroy yourself chasing something you'll never be good enough for. The truth of it hit me then, standing in that grimy garage with the smell of failure hanging in the air like exhaust fume. Frank Romano wasn't trying to protect me from disappointment, he was protecting himself from the possibility that I might succeed in ways he never could, that I might become something he never had the courage to try to be. His limitations had become his identity, and he needed me to accept those same limitations to validate his own choices. I'm going, I said simply, with or without your support, I'm going to serve my country and become an officer. And someday, you're going to understand that you were wrong about me. Mark my words, Valerie, Frank said, turning back to his work with deliberate finality. You'll be back here in 6 months, tail between your legs, begging for your old job at the diner. The military chews up dreamers like you and spits them out. Don't come crying to me when reality hits and you realize you're not special. I walked out of that garage and didn't look back, but I heard Marcus follow me. He caught up to me at the bottom of the stairs leading to our apartment, his young face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Val, he doesn't mean it, he said, but we both knew that wasn't true. He's scared, that's all. After Mom died, he's been scared of losing anyone else. I pulled my little brother into a hug, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with motor oil. Marcus, I need you to remember something, okay? Our father loves us, but his love is limited by his fear. Don't ever let his limitations become your limitations. Promise me that. He nodded against my shoulder, and I could feel him crying. Are you really going to leave? I'm really going, I said, and for the first time that day, I felt certain about my decision. But I'm not leaving you. I'm going to show both of you what's possible when someone believes in themselves enough to try. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of 18 years of dreaming. My academic awards were still tacked to the bulletin board above my desk, along with photos of my mother and me at various science fairs and school events. There was my certificate from the state engineering competition, my honor roll ribbons, my acceptance letter to Ohio State that I'd turned down because we couldn't afford it, all the evidence of potential that Frank had chosen to ignore. I pulled out a notebook and began writing down everything I wanted to accomplish in the military, not because I thought Frank would ever read it, but because I needed to commit my dreams to something permanent. I wrote about wanting to lead soldiers, to use my engineering skills to save lives, to serve something bigger than myself. I wrote about proving that small-town girls with big dreams weren't foolish, they were necessary. 6 weeks later, Marcus drove me to the Greyhound station in Columbus. Frank hadn't come downstairs when I left, though I'd heard him moving around in his room above the shop. There was no goodbye, no good luck, no acknowledgement that his daughter was leaving to serve her country, just the silence of a man who'd made his position clear and refused to reconsider. The bus pulled away from Millbrook as the sun came up, carrying me toward a future I could barely imagine but was determined to create. I pressed my face to the window and watched the town grow smaller, thinking about my mother's last words to me before she died. She'd been in the hospital, weak from chemotherapy but still fighting, when she'd taken my hand and made me promise to never let anyone convince me I was ordinary. Extraordinary isn't something you're born with, Misha, she'd whispered, using the Spanish endearment she'd learned from her grandmother. It's something you choose to become, every single day. Promise me you'll choose to become everything you're capable of being. I'd kept that promise through 4 years of high school after she died, through community college while working nights at the diner, and through all the small-town voices that suggested I should be satisfied with safe and predictable. Now as Ohio farmland rolled past my window, I renewed that promise. I was going to become everything I was capable of being, and someday, Frank Romano was going to understand exactly what he'd dismissed when he'd called me ordinary. The bus rumbled south toward Fort Benning, Georgia, carrying me toward a destiny my father couldn't imagine, and a future that would prove him wrong in ways he'd never expected. In my duffel bag, along with the few possessions I deemed essential, I carried that acceptance letter to officer candidate school and a photograph of my mother taken at my high school graduation. She was smiling with the kind of pride Frank had never learned to show, and her eyes held the certainty that her daughter was meant for something special. I had no idea that 8 years later, I'd be standing in a room full of generals and colonels, watching my father's face as he finally understood what my mother had always seen. But that moment was coming, built on every challenge I was about to face, every limit I was about to shatter, and every impossible thing I was about to make possible through sheer determination and the kind of courage that runs in the blood of dreamers who refuse to accept ordinary as their fate. Basic training at Fort Benning was designed to break people down and rebuild them into soldiers, but for me it felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. The red clay dust of Georgia settled into my boots and under my fingernails, and the relentless summer heat reminded me that comfort was a luxury I'd never really known anyway. While other recruits complained about the early morning wake-up calls and the demanding physical training, I found myself thriving in an environment where effort was rewarded and excellence was expected rather than dismissed. Drill Sergeant Martinez was a compact woman with scars on her hands and steel in her voice, who took one look at my file and decided I needed special attention, not the kind that breaks you down, but the kind that pushes you past what you thought possible.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She'd served 3 tours in Iraq as a combat engineer, and something in my background had caught her eye. Maybe it was the engineering degree, or maybe it was the fact that I'd listed my emergency contact as my brother instead of my father, but she seemed to understand that I was running towards something rather than away from it. Romano, she called out during our 3rd week of training, after I'd successfully completed a particularly challenging obstacle course in record time. You've got coordination and you've got brain. What you need is confidence in your own leadership. I'm putting you in charge of weapons maintenance for your squad. The assignment came with 23 other recruits looking to me for guidance on caring for equipment that could mean the difference between life and death in combat. Some of them were older than me, some had more natural physical ability, but none of them had spent their teenage years learning that every mechanical system has a logic to it, a way of working that makes sense once you understand its purpose. My father had unknowingly prepared me for this moment. Every time he'd made me hand him tools while he worked on engines, every time he'd explained how one broken part could destroy an entire system. Within a week, our squad had the highest marks for equipment readiness in the entire company. The other recruits stopped questioning my instructions and started seeking my advice on everything from properly cleaning rifle barrels to troubleshooting communication equipment. For the first time in my life, people looked at me and saw competence instead of potential disappointment. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim visited our training battalion during our 6th week, observing various exercises and interviewing select recruits about their career aspirations. She was a slight woman with prematurely gray hair and intelligent eyes, who had earned her rank through 2 decades of exemplary service in military intelligence. When she pulled me aside after watching me lead my squad through a complex tactical exercise, I expected another routine interview about my plans after basic training. Your instructors speak very highly of your analytical skills and natural leadership abilities, she said, consulting a tablet that contained more information about me than I'd realized the military possessed. I understand you're planning to attend officer candidate school after completing basic training. Yes, ma'am, I want to specialize in combat engineering, hopefully focusing on explosive ordnance disposal and route clearance operations. Lieutenant Colonel Kim studied me for a long moment, and I got the feeling she was seeing something that others had missed. Those are high-stress, high-responsibility positions that require absolute trust from the soldiers under your command. What makes you think you're prepared for that level of responsibility? The question wasn't asked with skepticism, but with genuine curiosity about how I saw myself and my capability. I thought about my father's auto shop, about all the times I'd watched him diagnose complex mechanical problems by listening carefully and thinking systematically. I thought about my mother's patient explanations of structural engineering principles as we built model bridges together. Most of all, I thought about Marcus and the promise I'd made to show him what was possible. Ma'am, I've spent my whole life learning that complex problems have logical solutions, and that most people give up too early when things get difficult. In combat engineering, soldiers' lives depend on someone who won't give up when the problem seems impossible, someone who can think clearly under pressure and find solutions that others might miss. I know I can be that person because I've been preparing for it my entire life, even when I didn't realize that's what I was doing. She made a note on her tablet and then looked up with what might have been the beginning of a smile. I'm recommending you for an accelerated officer track with a specialty focus on advanced explosive ordnance disposal. It's a demanding program with a high washout rate, but I think you have the combination of technical skills and mental toughness to succeed. Are you interested? Advanced EOD training meant an additional year of specialized instruction after officer candidate school, working with the most sophisticated and dangerous explosive devices that military engineers encountered in combat zones. It meant responsibility for clearing routes that entire convoys would depend on, making split-second decisions about devices that could kill dozens of people if handled incorrectly. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, technically demanding work that my father would never believe I was capable of handling. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. 3 months later, I graduated basic training as the distinguished honor graduate of my company, ranking first in physical fitness, weapons proficiency, and leadership evaluations. Marcus had driven down from Ohio with Miss Henderson to attend the graduation ceremony, both of them beaming with pride as I received my awards. Frank Romano had declined to make the trip, claiming the auto shop was too busy to close even for a day. Marcus told me later that their father had watched the live-streamed ceremony on his computer in the shop office, but had never mentioned it to anyone. Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning was where I learned the difference between following orders and giving them effectively. The academic coursework covered military history, strategic planning, personnel management, and advanced technical subjects that pushed my analytical abilities to their limits. The practical exercises involved leading teams of other officer candidates through complex scenarios designed to test judgment, communication skills, and the ability to make sound decisions under pressure. Captain James Foster became my mentor during OCS, a soft-spoken man from Alabama who had earned his commission through enlisted ranks and understood what it meant to prove yourself to people who doubted your capabilities. He had served multiple combat deployments as an engineer officer and possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from making life-and-death decisions in impossible circumstances. Romano leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room, he told me during one of our weekly counseling sessions, after I'd struggled with a particularly challenging command exercise involving coordination between multiple units. It's about creating an environment where everyone else can be smart, where good ideas can come from anywhere, and where people trust your judgment enough to follow you into dangerous situations. The lesson stuck with me through the remaining months of OCS, particularly during the final field exercise that would determine our class rankings and future assignment. I was given command of a platoon-sized element tasked with clearing a simulated enemy position while minimizing casualties and achieving specific tactical objectives. The scenario was designed to present impossible choices and test how officer candidates handled situations where no perfect solution existed. My approach was to gather information from every member of my team, assign responsibilities based on individual strengths rather than rank or seniority, and maintain constant communication as the situation evolved. When two of my squad leaders disagreed about the best route of advance, I listened to both perspectives, analyzed the terrain myself, and made a decision that incorporated elements of both plans while addressing the concerns each leader had raised. The exercise concluded with our objectives achieved ahead of schedule and 0 simulated casualties, but more importantly, every member of my platoon felt heard and valued throughout the operation. Captain Foster observed the entire exercise and later told me that I demonstrated exactly the kind of inclusive leadership style that produced results in combat situations where conventional military hierarchy might break down under stress. I graduated OCS ranked second in my class of 157 officer candidates, earning my commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army with orders to report to the Naval School of Explosive Ordnance Disposal at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The advanced EOD course would last 8 months and had a failure rate approaching 40%, with academic washouts, psychological stress casualties, and medical disqualifications claiming students who had excelled in previous military training. The night before I left for Florida, I called Marcus from my temporary quarters at Fort Benning. He was finishing his senior year of high school and had been accepted to Ohio State's engineering program, following a path similar to mine but with family support I'd never received. "Val, Dad asked about you yesterday," he said, his voice careful in the way it got when he was trying to share good news that might not be entirely good. He was talking to Mr. Peterson from the hardware store, and Peterson mentioned seeing your graduation ceremony online. Dad said you looked professional in your uniform. It wasn't much, but it was the first positive comment Frank had made about my military service since I'd left home. I wondered if he was beginning to understand that I wasn't going to come crawling back to Millbrook with my tail between my legs, begging for forgiveness and a job at the diner. Perhaps seeing me in an army dress uniform, standing at attention while receiving commendations for academic and leadership excellence, had planted a seed of doubt about his assessment of my capabilities. "How's the shop doing?" I asked, genuinely concerned about my father's business and his ability to manage everything alone. "Good, actually, really good. He hired Tommy Castellanos to help with the heavy work, and Mrs. Chen has been handling the books since her husband retired from the plant. Dad's talking about expanding into small engine repair, maybe lawn mowers and generators." He's actually smiling some days. The news should have made me happy, but instead it highlighted how unnecessary I'd been to my father's life and plan. Frank Romano was thriving without me, building the business he'd always wanted while I pursued dreams he'd never understood or supported. It reinforced my determination to succeed in EOD training, not to prove him wrong anymore, but to prove to myself that I'd made the right choice in leaving everything familiar behind. Explosive ordnance disposal training at Eglin was unlike anything I'd experienced in my military career up to that point. The technical complexity of modern explosive devices required mastering chemistry, electronics, mechanical engineering, and computer programming, while developing the kind of steady nerves that allow someone to work calmly with devices designed to kill anyone who makes a mistake. Our days began before dawn with physical training designed to build stamina and stress tolerance, followed by hours of classroom instruction covering everything from improvised explosive device construction to advanced robotics operation. The practical exercises involved real explosive devices in controlled environments, with instructors monitoring every move and ready to intervene if a student made an error that could prove fatal. We learned to approach suspicious packages with systematic caution, using specialized equipment to X-ray contents, disrupt triggering mechanisms, and safely dispose of explosive material. The work demanded absolute precision and complete confidence in your own abilities, because hesitation or second-guessing could get people killed just as easily as recklessness. Sergeant First Class Lisa Chang became my training partner and closest friend during the grueling months at Eglin. She was a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, who had enlisted after completing a degree in electrical engineering and shared my passion for solving complex technical problems under pressure. Lisa had grown up with parents who expected excellence and supported her ambitions, giving her a confidence I was still building in myself. "You know what your problem is, Romano," she said one evening as we reviewed circuit diagrams for improvised explosive devices in our shared study room. "You're still trying to prove you belong here instead of just accepting that you do belong here. Look at your test scores. Look at your performance evaluations. Look at how the instructors respond to your questions. You're not just keeping up, you're setting the pace." She was right, but recognizing the truth of it was harder than mastering the technical aspects of explosive ordnance disposal. Every success felt temporary. Every challenge felt like a potential moment when my father's predictions about my limitations would finally prove accurate. I was carrying the weight of his skepticism like extra equipment, slowing me down and making everything more difficult than it needed to be. The breakthrough came during our final practical examination, a complex scenario involving multiple explosive devices hidden throughout a mock urban environment. Students were given 4 hours to locate, analyze, and safely neutralize all threats, while working under simulated combat conditions including time pressure, communication difficulties, and physical obstacles designed to induce stress and fatigue. I approached the exercise methodically, using detection equipment to map the entire area before attempting to address any individual device. When I found the first improvised explosive device concealed inside what appeared to be abandoned electronic equipment, I took the time to photograph it from multiple angles and analyze the wiring pattern before beginning disarmament procedure. The device used a complex triggering mechanism that required disabling 3 separate circuits in a specific sequence, but the logic of it became clear once I understood the bomber's design philosophy. The second and third devices were variations on the same basic design, allowing me to work more quickly while maintaining the systematic approach that had served me well throughout training. By the time I located the fourth and most sophisticated device, I was working with complete confidence in my abilities and total focus on the technical challenge rather than worrying about potential failure. The final device was designed to test everything we'd learned about advanced electronics, mechanical engineering, and chemical explosive compounds. It incorporated anti-tampering features that would detonate the device if approached incorrectly, multiple redundant triggering systems, and a timing mechanism that added urgency to an already complex disarmament procedure. I spent 40 minutes analyzing the device before making my first physical intervention, using X-ray equipment and electronic sensors to understand its internal structure completely. When I finally began the disarmament sequence, every movement was deliberate and precise. I disabled the anti-tampering systems first, then worked systematically through the multiple triggering mechanisms, saving the primary explosive charge for last. The entire process required 3 hours and 17 minutes, well within the time limit but slower than I would have liked for a real-world scenario. Chief Warrant Officer Martinez, our lead instructor, approached me as I completed the final safety check on the neutralized device. He was a 20-year veteran who had served multiple combat deployments and possessed the kind of hard-earned expertise that came from handling real explosive devices in life-and-death situations. "Outstanding work, Lieutenant Romano," he said, examining my documentation of the disarmament procedures. "Your methodical approach and attention to safety protocols would have saved lives in a combat environment. More importantly, you demonstrated the kind of steady nerves and clear thinking that EOD teams depend on when situations get complicated." I graduated from advanced EOD training ranked third in my class with specialty qualifications in improvised explosive device disposal, chemical ordnance handling, and explosive detection robotics. My first assignment was to the 52nd Ordnance Disposal Company at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where I would serve as a platoon leader responsible for 18 soldiers and some of the most sophisticated explosive disposal equipment in the military inventory. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes commanded the 52nd Ordnance Disposal Company, and she had a reputation throughout the Army as an officer who demanded excellence from herself and everyone under her command. She was a tall woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes who had earned her position through demonstrated competence in some of the most dangerous military specialties. When I reported to her office for my initial assignment briefing, I expected the kind of routine orientation that new officers typically receive. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes spent 2 hours reviewing my training records, asking detailed questions about my technical background, and discussing the specific challenges facing EOD teams in contemporary military operations. She seemed particularly interested in my systematic approach to problem solving and my ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that she described as essential for the kind of missions her unit regularly performed. "Lieutenant Romano, I'm assigning you to Alpha Platoon, which handles our most complex disposal operations," she said, consulting a thick folder that contained operational summaries and personnel evaluation. "Your soldiers are experienced professionals who have deployed to combat zones multiple times, and they'll be evaluating your technical competence and leadership abilities from day one. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" The question was asked without hostility, but with the directness of an officer who needed to know that her subordinates could handle responsibility under pressure. I thought about my father's auto shop, about basic training, about OCS, and about all the times people had doubted my capabilities before giving me a chance to prove myself. "Yes, ma'am, I'm prepared to earn their trust through demonstrated competence and reliable leadership. I understand that in EOD operations, trust isn't given automatically based on rank, it's earned through performance when lives are on the line." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes nodded approvingly and closed my personnel file. "Your platoon deploys to Afghanistan in 6 months. Between now and then, I want you focused on advanced training exercises with your soldiers and developing the kind of unit cohesion that keeps people alive in combat. Any questions?" I had dozens of questions about deployment logistics, operational procedures, and the specific challenges we'd face in Afghanistan, but only one that really mattered at that moment. "Ma'am, what kind of missions should I expect my platoon to handle in theater?" "The kind that other people can't handle, Lieutenant. Route clearance for convoys moving through areas with heavy IED activity, disposal of complex explosive devices that require advanced technical skills, and emergency response to situations where conventional approaches won't work. Your soldiers are among the best in the Army at what they do, and now it's your job to lead them effectively." That evening I called Marcus from my quarters at Fort Campbell to share the news about my assignment and upcoming deployment. He was finishing his freshman year at Ohio State and had joined the Engineering Honor Society, following the academic path that I'd helped inspire him to pursue. "Afghanistan," his voice carried the concern that family members always felt when loved ones prepared for combat deployment. "Val, that's serious. Have you told Dad?" I hadn't spoken to Frank Romano since leaving for basic training almost 2 years earlier. Our communication had been limited to occasional messages passed through Marcus, and even those had been brief and impersonal. The idea of calling him to discuss my upcoming deployment felt strange and potentially futile, given his continued skepticism about my military career. "Not yet. I'm not sure what I would tell him, or if he'd want to hear it. He asks about you, you know, not directly, but he asked. Last month when Mrs. Peterson mentioned seeing something about military promotions in the local paper, he wanted to know if I thought your name might be in there. He's proud of you, Val, even if he doesn't know how to show it." The conversation left me wondering if my father had begun to reconsider his assessment of my potential, or if he was simply curious about how long it would take for the military to confirm his predictions about my limitation. Either way, I realized that his opinion had become less important to me as I'd gained confidence in my own abilities and found my place in an organization that valued competence over background. 6 months later, I boarded a military transport aircraft at Fort Campbell with my 18 soldiers, bound for Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan, and a deployment that would test everything I'd learned about leadership, technical expertise, and performing under pressure. As the aircraft lifted off into the Kentucky dawn, I looked out at the American landscape disappearing below and thought about the promise I'd made to my mother about becoming everything I was capable of being. The girl who had left Millbrook with nothing but determination and a community college engineering degree was now a commissioned Army officer responsible for soldiers' lives in one of the most dangerous military occupations. Frank Romano's predictions about my limitations had been proven wrong at every stage of my military career, but the ultimate test was still ahead. In Afghanistan, there would be no instructors monitoring my performance, no safety nets if I made critical errors, and no second chances if my leadership failed when my soldiers needed it most. Afghanistan hit me like stepping into a furnace filled with dust and diesel fumes. Bagram Airfield sprawled across the landscape like a sprawling industrial city, complete with concrete barriers, guard towers, and the constant drone of helicopters ferrying personnel and supplies to forward operating bases scattered throughout the country. The mountains in the distance looked deceptively peaceful, their snow-covered peaks gleaming in the harsh sunlight, but I knew those same mountains concealed insurgent networks that had been perfecting improvised explosive device tactics for over a decade. My platoon's temporary quarters were located in a cluster of prefabricated buildings near the airfield's main runway, close enough that we could hear transport aircraft landing and taking off at all hours of the day and night. The soldiers under my command had arrived 3 days before me, giving them time to adjust to the altitude and establish our operational routine. When I walked into our platoon area for the first time, 18 pairs of eyes evaluated me with the kind of professional assessment that experienced soldiers reserved for new officers in combat zones. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres stepped forward to greet me, a compact man with weathered hands and intelligent eyes who had served as the platoon's acting leader during the transition period. His personnel file indicated 3 previous combat deployments and commendations for actions under fire, including a Bronze Star for valor earned during route clearance operations in Iraq. The other soldiers respected him, I could tell immediately, and his opinion of my leadership capabilities would significantly influence how quickly the platoon accepted me as their officer. "Good morning, Lieutenant Romano," he said, offering a crisp salute that the other soldiers mirrored. "Alpha Platoon is ready for your inspection and briefing on current operational status." I returned the salute and then took a moment to study the faces of my soldiers, noting the mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and professional courtesy that new officers typically encountered from experienced enlisted personnel. These were men and women who had volunteered for one of the military's most dangerous specialties, and they possessed technical skills that had been refined through years of training and real-world application. My job was to provide leadership that enhanced their effectiveness rather than hindering it through inexperience or poor judgment. Staff Sergeant Torres, I'd like to meet with each squad leader individually over the next 2 days to understand our capabilities, current mission requirements, and any operational challenges you've identified, I said, addressing him but speaking loudly enough for the entire platoon to hear. After that, we'll conduct a comprehensive equipment inspection and training exercise to ensure everyone understands my expectations for technical proficiency and safety protocols. The soldiers exchanged glances that suggested cautious optimism about my approach. Rather than immediately asserting authority through dramatic changes or unnecessary demonstrations of rank, I was indicating respect for their experience and a desire to understand the situation before making decisions that could affect their safety and mission effectiveness. Specialist Jennifer Walsh, our platoon's senior robotics operator, raised her hand with a question that I sensed carried significance beyond its apparent simplicity. "Ma'am, what's your experience with the MK2 disposal robots in actual field conditions? We've had some technical issues that the manuals don't cover, and our previous officer wasn't really familiar with the electronic systems." The question was a test, I realized, designed to determine whether I possessed genuine technical expertise or was simply another officer who relied on enlisted personnel to handle complex problem solving. Walsh was a slight woman from Oregon who had earned her position through demonstrated competence with some of the most sophisticated equipment in our inventory, and her respect would be crucial for maintaining platoon morale and effectiveness. I spent considerable time with MK2 systems during advanced training at Eglin, including troubleshooting electronic malfunctions under simulated combat conditions, I replied, meeting her gaze directly. "What specific technical issues have you encountered? Are we dealing with communication link problems, manipulator arm calibration errors, or sensor integration difficulty. Walsh's expression shifted from skeptical evaluation to genuine interest as she realized I understood the technical terminology and operational challenges associated with our robotic system. Primarily, communication link stability when operating beyond 200 meters, especially in areas with significant electromagnetic interference from power lines or radio transmission. That's typically caused by frequency conflict between the control unit and local transmitters, or signal degradation due to atmospheric conditions affecting microwave propagation. Drawing on technical knowledge that had been theoretical until now, but was about to become critically important. We can modify the transmission protocols and adjust antenna positioning to compensate for most interference patterns, but it requires systematic testing under actual field conditions. The conversation continued for several minutes, with other soldiers contributing questions about equipment capabilities, maintenance procedures, and tactical applications that demonstrated both their professional competence and their willingness to accept me as their technical leader. By the time we concluded the initial briefing, I sensed that Alpha Platoon was prepared to give me a chance to prove myself worthy of their trust and respect. Our first mission came 5 days later, a routine route clearance operation along Highway 1 between Bagram and Kabul that intelligence reports indicated might contain newly emplaced improvised explosive devices. A convoy of supply trucks needed to transport critical medical supplies to a forward operating base, and our platoon was responsible for ensuring their safe passage through an area where insurgents had recently increased their activity. The pre-mission briefing took place in a concrete building that served as our tactical operations center, with maps, satellite imagery, and intelligence summaries covering every surface. Captain Rodriguez, our company operations officer, outlined the mission parameters while emphasizing the importance of thoroughness over speed in our clearance procedures. Intelligence suggests at least 3 IEDs along the primary route, with possible secondary devices positioned to target disposal teams, he explained, pointing to specific locations marked on aerial photographs. Local nationals reported suspicious activity near Checkpoint Charlie 3 nights ago, including individuals carrying what appeared to be construction materials and electronic equipment. I studied the route carefully, noting natural choke points where vehicles would be forced to slow down, areas with limited visibility that could conceal observers, and potential escape routes that insurgents might use after triggering explosive devices. The tactical situation required balancing thorough clearance procedures with time constraints imposed by convoy scheduling and security considerations. "Sir, I recommend a 2-phase approach," I said, addressing Captain Rodriguez while ensuring my soldiers could hear my reasoning. "Initial reconnaissance using our detection robots to identify potential device locations, followed by systematic clearance procedures for confirmed threats. We'll establish overwatch positions to provide security during disposal operations, and maintain constant communication with convoy elements." Captain Rodriguez nodded approvingly and turned to Staff Sergeant Torres for his assessment of the plan. "Sergeant Torres, does Lieutenant Romano's approach align with your operational experience and platoon capabilities?" "Yes, the lieutenant's plan addresses our primary security concerns while allowing flexibility to adapt if we encounter unexpected situations," Torres replied, and I could hear genuine respect in his voice. "Alpha Platoon is ready to execute the mission as outlined." 2 hours later, we loaded our vehicles with detection equipment, disposal robots, and enough explosive ordnance to neutralize anything we might encounter along highway. The morning air was crisp and clear as we departed Bagram, with mountains providing a dramatic backdrop for what would become my first real test of combat leadership. Our convoy consisted of 3 heavily armored vehicles carrying my 18 soldiers plus supporting personnel from other units, including medics, communications specialists, and additional security elements. I rode in the lead vehicle with Staff Sergeant Torres and our primary detection equipment, maintaining radio contact with all elements while monitoring intelligence updates from headquarters. The first potential device location was identified 12 kilometers from Bagram, where our detection equipment register electromagnetic signatures consistent with improvised explosive devices concealed beneath the road surface. I called a halt to convoy movement and deployed Specialist Walsh with her robotic systems to conduct detailed reconnaissance of the suspected area. "Control, this is Robot 1, Walsh reported through our communication system. "I'm detecting metallic objects approximately 2 meters off the roadway, consistent with command detonated IEDs using conventional explosive compounds." Recommend personnel evacuation to safe distance before beginning disposal procedure. I established a security perimeter around the suspected device location while Walsh maneuvered her robot to provide detailed imagery of the explosive device and its triggering mechanism. The IED appeared to be professionally constructed, with redundant detonation systems and anti-tampering features designed to kill anyone who approached it incorrectly. Walsh, can you determine the specific triggering mechanism from your current position? I asked, studying the robot's video feed on my portable monitor. I'm seeing what appears to be a pressure plate system, but there might be additional electronic components we can't identify from this angle. Ma'am, the device uses a dual trigger system combining pressure activation with remote command detonation, she replied, manipulating the robot's sensors to provide multiple perspectives on the explosive device. I can disable the pressure plate mechanism using the robot's manipulator arm, but the remote detonation capability requires manual intervention by qualified personnel. Manual intervention meant that someone would have to approach the device physically and work with live explosives while exposed to potential enemy observation and additional threat. It was exactly the kind of situation that separated experienced DoD technicians from those who lacked the technical skills or mental toughness to perform under extreme pressure. Torres, establish overwatch positions with clear fields of fire covering the device location and potential enemy approach routes, I ordered, then turned to Specialist Martinez, our most experienced bomb disposal technician. Martinez, you're with me on the manual approach. Walsh will provide robot support and maintain communication with our security element. The walk from our protected position to the improvised explosive device felt longer than the actual 50 meters, with each step carrying the possibility of triggering secondary devices or drawing enemy fire from hidden positions. Martinez moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had performed similar operations dozens of times, while I focused on maintaining situational awareness and preparing for the technical challenges ahead. The IED was more sophisticated than our initial assessment had indicated, incorporating electronic components that suggested construction by experienced bomb makers with access to advanced materials. The pressure plate trigger was connected to approximately 20 pounds of conventional explosives, sufficient to destroy any vehicle that passed over it, while the remote detonation system allowed insurgents to target specific vehicles or personnel from a safe distance. Lieutenant, this device shows characteristics consistent with Iranian-manufactured components, Martinez observed, examining the electronic triggering mechanism through his protective equipment. The wiring patterns and circuit board design match intelligence reports from other regions where similar devices have been encountered. The information was significant because it suggested coordination between local insurgent groups and external suppliers with access to sophisticated explosive technology. Our disposal procedures would need to account for potential booby traps and anti-tampering features that might not be immediately visible. Working together, Martinez and I systematically disabled the device's multiple triggering systems, beginning with the most accessible components and progressing toward the primary explosive charge. The process required 47 minutes of concentrated work under combat conditions, with constant awareness that enemy observers might be positioning themselves to attack our security elements or trigger additional device. Control, this is Alpha 6. I reported to Captain Rodriguez as we completed the disposal operation. Device successfully neutralized without incident. Continuing route clearance operations toward Checkpoint Charlie. Outstanding work, Alpha 6. Intelligence indicates possible additional devices at Checkpoint Charlie location. Maintain heightened security posture and report any suspicious activity immediately. The second device location proved even more challenging, with multiple IEDs positioned to create a complex ambush that would have devastated any convoy attempting to pass through without proper clearance procedure. Our systematic approach to detection and disposal prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life and equipment, while demonstrating to my soldiers that their new officer possessed both technical competence and sound tactical judgment. By the time we completed the mission and returned to Bagram, Alpha Platoon had successfully cleared 17 kilometers of highway and neutralized 4 improvised explosive devices of varying complexity. The convoy of medical supplies had reached its destination safely, and our performance had earned recognition from higher headquarters for exceptional professionalism under combat conditions. Staff Sergeant Torres approached me during our post-mission equipment maintenance, his demeanor indicating something beyond routine operational discussion. Ma'am, I wanted to say that your performance today was exactly what this platoon needed: professional, technically competent, and focused on mission accomplishment and soldier safety. The troops respect that kind of leadership. The comment meant more to me than any official commendation or performance evaluation could have, because it represented acceptance by soldiers whose lives depended on my decisions and whose professional standards were based on real-world experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Alpha Platoon was beginning to function as a cohesive unit under my leadership, with mutual trust replacing the initial skepticism that had characterized our first interaction. Over the following months, our operational tempo increased as insurgent activity intensified throughout our area of responsibility. Alpha Platoon conducted route clearance missions almost daily, responded to emergency situations involving complex explosive devices, and provided technical expertise to other units encountering ordnance-related challenges. Each mission reinforced my confidence in the soldiers under my command while testing my ability to make sound decisions under increasingly difficult circumstances. The mission that would define my deployment and establish my reputation throughout the brigade came during our 6th month in Afghanistan, when intelligence reports indicated that a major insurgent operation was planned against a key supply route connecting Bagram with forward operating bases in eastern province. Our platoon was assigned to conduct comprehensive route clearance along 40 kilometers of mountainous terrain, working with limited support and facing the most sophisticated IED threats we had encountered during our deployment. The pre-mission briefing revealed that insurgents had spent weeks preparing the ambush zone, emplacing multiple device types including buried explosives, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, and remotely detonated charges designed to target clearance teams specific. Intelligence estimates suggested at least 12 separate IEDs along the route, with additional devices positioned to attack helicopters attempting to provide medical evacuation or close air support. This is the most complex threat environment we've encountered, Captain Rodriguez explained during the briefing, his tone reflecting the seriousness of the situation. Higher headquarters considers this mission essential for maintaining supply line security, but they're also emphasizing that no mission is worth unnecessary casualties. If conditions become too dangerous, you have authority to abort and request additional resources. I studied the route carefully, noting natural terrain features that insurgents would likely exploit and identifying potential helicopter landing zones that could be used for emergency evacuation if my soldiers were wounded during the operation. The mission would require every skill we had developed as a platoon, plus flawless coordination between all elements to minimize exposure to enemy fire while conducting thorough clearance procedure. Sir, Alpha Platoon is prepared to execute the mission as planned, I replied, meeting Captain Rodriguez's gaze directly. We understand the risks and have developed contingency procedures for various threat scenarios. My soldiers are the best in the brigade at what they do, and I have complete confidence in their abilities. The statement was true, but it also represented a level of personal commitment to my soldiers and their safety that went beyond professional responsibility. Over 6 months of combat operations, Alpha Platoon had become more than just the unit I commanded. They had become family members whose welfare was as important to me as mission accomplished. The operation began before dawn with helicopter insertion at the starting point of our assigned route, avoiding predictable movement patterns that insurgents might have observed during previous missions. Our 3 vehicles moved in tactical formation along the mountain road, with detection equipment continuously scanning for electromagnetic signatures or unusual terrain features that might indicate concealed explosive device. The first device was located within 30 minutes of beginning our clearance procedures, positioned at a natural choke point where the road narrowed between steep rocky slopes that limited maneuver options. Our robotic reconnaissance revealed a sophisticated buried IED connected to observation posts on the surrounding high ground, suggesting that insurgents were prepared to detonate the device remotely when our vehicles approached. Control, this is Alpha 6, I reported to headquarters while studying the tactical situation through binoculars. We've identified a complex ambush position with prepared observation posts and at least one confirmed IED. Recommend immediate close air support to suppress enemy positions before continuing clearance operations. Alpha 6, close air support is unavailable due to weather conditions at departure airfield. You're authorized to use organic weapons systems to engage identified enemy positions, but avoid activities that might trigger premature detonation of explosive device. The tactical problem required balancing aggressive action to neutralize enemy observers with careful procedures to avoid accidental detonation of the very devices we were attempting to clear safe. I positioned our vehicles to provide maximum protection for disposal teams while maintaining fields of fire against potential enemy positions, then coordinated simultaneous engagement of observation posts with systematic approach to the buried explosive device. Specialist Walsh deployed her robot system while Staff Sergeant Torres directed precision rifle fire against suspected enemy positions, creating sufficient suppression to allow detailed reconnaissance of the IED and its triggering mechanism. The device proved to be even more complex than our initial assessment had suggested, incorporating motion sensors, infrared detectors, and multiple explosive charges positioned to create maximum casualties among clearance personnel. Ma'am, this device is designed specifically to target EOD teams, Martinez reported after completing his initial assessment. The triggering system includes anti-tampering features that will detonate the primary charge if approached incorrectly, plus secondary devices positioned to attack anyone providing security during disposal operation. The information confirmed that insurgents had been studying our tactics and developing countermeasures designed to exploit predictable patterns in our clearance procedure. Successfully neutralizing this device would require adapting our techniques while maintaining safety protocols that had kept my soldiers alive through months of similar operation. Working methodically under enemy observation, Martinez and I spent 3 hours disabling the complex triggering systems while our security teams maintained overwatch against potential attack from surrounding terrain. The process required absolute concentration and precise coordination between all platoon elements, with each soldier understanding that a single mistake could result in multiple casualties. When we finally neutralized the device and prepared to continue our mission, I realized that Alpha Platoon had just accomplished something that would have been impossible without months of training together and developing the kind of mutual trust that allows soldiers to perform effectively under extreme conditions. My leadership had been tested in the most demanding circumstances imaginable, and both my soldiers and I had proven capable of rising to meet that challenge. The remaining 37 kilometers of route clearance revealed 11 additional IEDs of varying complexity, each requiring systematic approach and careful neutralization while under potential enemy observation. By the time we completed the mission 18 hours later, Alpha Platoon had cleared the most heavily defended insurgent ambush position encountered by any unit in our brigade, enabling safe passage for critical supply convoys while suffering 0 casualties despite constant enemy pressure. The after-action report from that mission would eventually reach senior military leadership and contribute to recognition that would follow me throughout my career. But at the time, I was simply proud of leading soldiers who had demonstrated exceptional courage and professional competence under conditions that tested every aspect of our training and preparation. Staff Sergeant Torres approached me during our post-mission debriefing, his expression reflecting the kind of professional satisfaction that came from accomplishing something truly difficult. Ma'am, I've served with a lot of officers during my career, but I've never seen anyone handle pressure like you did today. The troops know they can count on you to make the right decisions when everything's on the line. The comment represented more than personal recognition. It indicated that Alpha Platoon had evolved into exactly the kind of cohesive, effective unit that military organizations depend on to accomplish their most challenging mission. My soldiers trusted my leadership, I trusted their abilities, and together we had proven capable of succeeding against the most sophisticated threats our enemies could devise. That evening I sat in my quarters writing a letter to Marcus that I knew I might never send, trying to explain what it felt like to discover capabilities within myself that I had never imagined possible. The girl who had left Millbrook with nothing but determination and a community college degree, had become an officer leading some of the Army's most elite soldiers through combat operations that required every skill I had developed over years of military training. Frank Romano's predictions about my limitations seemed like echoes from another lifetime, irrelevant assessments made by someone who had never understood what I was capable of becoming, but I was beginning to realize that proving him wrong was no longer the driving force behind my military service. I was serving because I had found something I was genuinely good at, something that allowed me to use my abilities in ways that made a meaningful difference in the world. The war would eventually end and my deployment would conclude, but the confidence I had gained through leading Alpha Platoon in combat would remain with me for the rest of my life. I had discovered who I really was when everything was on the line, and that knowledge was worth more than any recognition or approval my father might have offered. The notification came on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a colonel I'd never met who had flown specifically from Kabul to Bagram to speak with me personally. Colonel William Hendricks was a career infantry officer with 3 decades of service, and his presence at our forward operating base indicated that something significant had happened beyond the normal chain of military bureaucracy. When he requested a private meeting in the base commander's office, I assumed it was related to an operational matter requiring my technical expertise or testimony about recent missions. Major Romano, he said, using a rank I hadn't yet earned, and I immediately understood that this conversation would change everything. The Secretary of the Army has approved your promotion to Major, effective immediately, along with your reassignment to the Pentagon as a special advisor on explosive ordnance disposal tactics and training. Your combat performance and innovative leadership methods have attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. The news should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt like leaving family. Alpha Platoon had become the most important thing in my life, and the idea of abandoning them for a desk job in Washington seemed like betrayal rather than advancement. These soldiers had trusted me with their lives, and I had learned more about leadership and personal courage through serving with them than any classroom or training exercise could have taught. Sir, with respect, I'd prefer to remain with my platoon through the completion of our deployment, I replied, knowing that such requests were rarely granted but needing to try anyway. Alpha Platoon has developed into an exceptionally effective unit, and changing leadership at this point in our deployment could compromise operational readiness. Colonel Hendricks studied me for a long moment, and I got the impression that my response had confirmed something he'd been told to expect. Major, your loyalty to your soldiers is exactly why senior leadership wants you in a position where you can influence training and tactics throughout the entire army. The techniques you've developed for complex IED disposal and the leadership methods you've used to build unit cohesion are being studied by officers at the highest levels. They want you to help train the next generation of leaders. The assignment represented opportunities that most officers could only dream of having: direct access to senior military leadership and the chance to influence policy and training procedures that would affect thousands of soldiers. But it also meant leaving behind the work that had given my life meaning and the soldiers who had become more important to me than career advancement or personal recognition. When would the reassignment take effect? I asked, already knowing that military orders allowed little flexibility for personal preferences or emotional considerations. You have 2 weeks to transition your platoon leadership to Captain Foster, who's being reassigned from the 3rd Infantry Division to take command of Alpha Platoon. Your flight to Washington is scheduled for November 15th, with reporting date to the Pentagon on November 20th. Captain James Foster was the same officer who had mentored me through officer candidate school, and I couldn't have asked for a better replacement. His experience and understanding of EOD operations would ensure continuity for my soldiers, while his leadership style would maintain the unit cohesion that Alpha Platoon had developed through months of combat operations together. The transition briefings with Captain Foster took place over several days, covering operational procedures, individual soldier capabilities, ongoing missions, and the tactical innovations we had developed through trial and error under combat conditions. Foster listened carefully to my assessments of each soldier's strengths and areas for development, asking detailed questions that demonstrated his commitment to maintaining the high standards Alpha Platoon had achieved. Your soldiers speak about you with the kind of respect that officers rarely earn from experienced enlisted personnel, he observed during one of our sessions. Staff Sergeant Torres told me that you've never asked them to do anything you weren't prepared to do yourself, and that you've consistently made decisions that prioritized their safety while accomplishing every assigned mission. The comment reflected exactly the kind of leadership philosophy I had tried to implement, based on mutual respect rather than simple adherence to military hierarchy. Alpha Platoon had succeeded because every soldier understood that their opinions were valued, their safety was paramount, and their professional competence was trusted and relied upon by their officers. My final mission with Alpha Platoon came 3 days before Captain Foster officially assumed command, a routine route clearance operation that turned into one of the most challenging situations we had faced during our entire deployment. Intelligence reports indicated possible IED activity along a secondary road used by local civilians and coalition forces, but initial reconnaissance suggested nothing more complex than the standard threats we had been dealing with for months. The reality proved far more complicated, with insurgents having prepared an elaborate ambush involving 7 separate explosive devices positioned to create multiple kill zones for anyone attempting clearance operation. The tactical situation required every skill and innovation we had developed as a unit, plus split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic casualty. Control, this is Alpha 6, I reported as our detection equipment identified the scope of the threat we were facing. We've got multiple IEDs in a complex pattern designed to channel our movement into prepared kill zones. This is going to require methodical clearance procedures with constant overwatch and immediate medical evacuation capability on standby. The operation took 11 hours to complete, with each device requiring individual assessment and disposal while maintaining security against potential enemy attack from concealed positions throughout the surrounding terrain. My soldiers performed with the kind of professional excellence that had made Alpha Platoon legendary within our brigade, adapting to unexpected challenges while maintaining safety protocols that had kept us alive through dozens of similar missions. Specialist Walsh demonstrated exceptional skill in using robotic systems to identify triggering mechanisms that would have been impossible to detect through conventional means, while Martinez and Staff Sergeant Torres coordinated disposal procedures that neutralized devices designed by some of the most sophisticated bomb makers we had encountered. The teamwork was flawless, representing months of training together and developing implicit trust in each other's abilities and judgment. When we finally cleared the last device and secured the route for civilian traffic,
I realized that this mission had provided a perfect demonstration of everything Alpha Platoon had learned and accomplished during our deployment together.
We had faced the most complex tactical situation of our tour and succeeded without casualties while enabling safe passage for local civilians who depended on coalition forces to maintain basic security. The after-action briefing that evening became an informal farewell ceremony, with soldiers sharing stories about missions we had completed together and expressing their appreciation for leadership that had enabled them to develop capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. These were professional soldiers who rarely showed emotion, but several of them spoke about how serving in Alpha Platoon had changed their understanding of what effective military leadership looked like. "Ma'am, you taught us that being professional doesn't mean being cold, and that caring about your soldiers' welfare actually makes them perform better rather than making them soft," Specialist Walsh said during the gathering. "I've learned more about leadership from watching you work than I did in all my previous assignments combined." Staff Sergeant Torres presented me with a combat patch signed by every member of the platoon, along with a letter expressing their gratitude for leadership that had brought them safely through one of the most dangerous deployments any of them had experienced. The gesture meant more to me than any official military decoration could have, because it represented recognition from soldiers whose professional standards were based on life-and-death situations rather than bureaucratic evaluation. My departure from Bagram took place on a gray November morning, with Alpha Platoon assembled in formation to render honors as I boarded the helicopter that would begin my journey back to the United States. The formal ceremony was brief, but as the aircraft lifted off, I could see my soldiers standing at attention until we disappeared beyond the mountain ridges that had defined our operational environment for almost a year. The flight back to the United States provided hours of uninterrupted time to reflect on everything that had changed since I'd left Fort Campbell as an untested officer leading soldiers who had questioned whether their new lieutenant possessed the competence and judgment necessary for combat operations. I was returning as a major with combat leadership experience that had earned recognition at the highest levels of military leadership, but more importantly, I had discovered capabilities within myself that I could never have imagined when Frank Romano dismissed my military ambitions as unrealistic dreams. The Pentagon assignment proved to be everything Colonel Hendricks had described, with opportunities to influence explosive ordnance disposal training throughout the Army and direct access to senior officers responsible for tactical innovation and equipment development. My combat experience with Alpha Platoon provided credibility that opened doors and enabled me to advocate for changes that would improve safety and effectiveness for EOD units worldwide. Working with the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, I helped develop new procedures for complex IED disposal that incorporated lessons learned during my deployment in Afghanistan. The techniques Alpha Platoon had developed through necessity became standard operating procedures taught to every EOD unit in the military, potentially saving lives in future combat operations while improving mission success rates under the most challenging conditions. The work was intellectually stimulating and professionally rewarding, but it also felt removed from the immediate reality of soldiers facing life and death decisions in combat zones. I missed the direct connection between my decisions and their immediate impact on soldier safety, the tangible results that came from successful mission completion, and the personal relationships that had made military service feel like a calling rather than simply a career. 6 months into my Pentagon assignment, I received notification that my combat performance in Afghanistan had earned me the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device, recognizing actions that went beyond the normal expectations of duty and contributed significantly to mission success under enemy fire. The award ceremony was scheduled for the following month, with General Patricia Hayes, now a 3-star general serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, personally presenting the decoration. The ceremony would take place at Fort Myer, with family members and distinguished military guests invited to attend the formal presentation. I had mixed feelings about the recognition, appreciating the acknowledgement of my soldiers' accomplishments, while feeling that individual awards couldn't adequately represent the team effort that had made our success possible in Afghanistan. Marcus called me the week before the ceremony to confirm that he would be attending, having taken time off from his engineering job in Columbus to witness his sister receiving one of the military's most prestigious decorations for combat valor. He had followed my military career with pride and amazement, watching the girl who had left Millbrook with nothing but determination become an officer whose achievements were being recognized at the highest levels of government and military leadership. "Val, I need to tell you something about Dad," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when discussing our father's gradual evolution regarding my military service. "He's been following your career more closely than you might realize." Peterson showed him the article in Army Times about your promotion and combat awards, and he spent the entire afternoon reading it over and over again. The news was surprising but not entirely unexpected, given Frank's tendency to maintain emotional distance while quietly monitoring developments that affected our family. I wondered if he was beginning to understand that his predictions about my limitations had been based on his own fears rather than accurate assessment of my capabilities. Did he say anything specific about the article or the ceremony? I asked, curious about his reaction but not entirely sure I wanted to know the details. He asked if I thought you would want him there, Marcus replied quietly. He said he might have been wrong about some things, and that maybe it was time he tried to understand what you'd accomplished. I told him that was something he'd have to decide for himself, but that you'd probably appreciate knowing he was proud of you. The conversation left me wondering whether Frank Romano had genuinely reconsidered his assessment of my potential or was simply responding to external recognition in ways that didn't necessarily reflect internal change. Either way, his apparent interest in attending the ceremony represented more engagement with my military career than he had shown since I'd enlisted almost 4 years earlier. The Bronze Star ceremony took place on a crisp December morning at Fort Myer, with family members, military colleagues, and distinguished guests assembled. In the Bronze Star ceremony had been everything I'd hoped for and more, with General Hayes presenting the medal with words that honored not just my individual actions but the entire Alpha Platoon team that had made our success possible. Frank had attended, sitting in the back row wearing an ill-fitting suit he'd borrowed from Marcus, his weathered hands folded carefully in his lap as he listened to citations that described his daughter's leadership under enemy fire in terms he was still learning to understand. After the ceremony, he'd approached me hesitantly, searching for words that had never come easily when the subject was pride in his children's achievement. "Valerie," he'd said, extending his hand formally as if we were meeting for the first time, "I want you to know that I heard everything they said about what you did over there. I may not understand all of it, but I understand that it was important." The conversation had been brief and awkward, limited by decades of emotional distance that couldn't be bridged in a single afternoon, but it represented more acknowledgement of my military service than Frank had ever offered before. He'd left immediately after the reception, claiming he needed to get back to the auto shop, but Marcus told me later that he'd kept a copy of the ceremony program in his wallet and had shown it to several customers over the following weeks. 2 years passed with my Pentagon assignment expanding into increasingly responsible positions, culminating in my promotion to lieutenant colonel and selection as the Army's primary liaison to Congress on explosive ordnance disposal funding and equipment requirements. The work involved testifying before congressional committees, briefing senior defense officials, and ensuring that lessons learned from recent combat operations were incorporated into future military planning and resource allocation. The professional recognition was gratifying, but it also meant that I was becoming further removed from the direct leadership of soldiers that had originally motivated my military service. I found myself longing for the immediate satisfaction of mission accomplishment and the personal relationships that had made command of Alpha Platoon the most meaningful experience. The opportunity to return to operational assignments came unexpectedly, when General Hayes called me to her office for what I assumed would be a routine briefing on congressional testimony I was scheduled to provide the following week. Instead, she offered me command of the 52nd Ordnance Disposal Company, the same unit where I had served as a platoon leader before deploying to Afghanistan, now expanded to include 3 separate EOD companies with over 200 soldiers. "Valerie, you've proven your competence at every level of responsibility we've given you," she said, using my first name in the informal manner she reserved for officers she considered protégés, rather than simply subordinate. "But I know that staff work, however important, isn't where your heart is. This command would put you back with soldiers, leading operations that directly impact their safety and mission success." The assignment represented everything I had hoped for professionally. The chance to lead at the battalion level while remaining connected to the technical and tactical aspects of explosive ordnance disposal that had originally attracted me to this military specialty. More importantly, it meant returning to the kind of direct leadership that had given my military career purpose beyond personal advancement or recognition. "Ma'am, I accept the assignment with gratitude and enthusiasm," I replied, understanding that this opportunity was the result of years of preparation and performance evaluations that had positioned me for command at this level. "When would the change of command ceremony take place?" 6 months from now, which will give you time to complete your current congressional commitments, while the current battalion commander transitions his responsibilities," General Hayes explained. "The ceremony will be held at Fort Campbell, with full military honors and family attendance encouraged. I plan to preside over the ceremony personally, given my interest in your career development and the importance of this particular command to our overall mission." The news meant that I would finally return to Kentucky and the operational environment where my military career had truly begun, leading soldiers whose work would directly impact the safety of American forces worldwide. It also meant that Frank Romano would have another opportunity to witness his daughter's achievements, assuming he chose to attend a ceremony that would demonstrate her progression to senior military leadership. I called Marcus that evening to share the news about my upcoming command assignment, knowing he would be excited about my return to operational duties and the recognition that battalion command represented within the military hierarchy. His reaction was everything I had expected, with genuine enthusiasm about my professional advancement and immediate plans to attend the change of command ceremony with extended family and friends. "Val, this is incredible news," he said, and I could hear the pride in his voice that had sustained me through years when our father's approval seemed impossible to earn. "Battalion command means you're being trusted with the lives and welfare of hundreds of soldiers. That's not something the Army gives to people unless they're absolutely confident in their judgment and leadership ability." We discussed the logistics of the ceremony and his plans to attend with his girlfriend and several of our neighbors from Millbrook, who had followed my military career with interest and pride. The conversation eventually turned to the question that both of us had been avoiding, whether Frank Romano would choose to attend this ceremony or continue maintaining emotional distance from achievements he still struggled to understand and acknowledge. "Have you talked to him about it?" I asked, uncertain whether I wanted Frank there or preferred to avoid the complications that his presence might create. "Not directly, but he's been asking more questions about your career lately," Marcus replied carefully. "Last week when Miss Peterson mentioned seeing something online about your promotion, he actually asked if I could show him the article. He spent about 20 minutes reading it, and I could tell he was trying to understand what it all meant." The idea that Frank was attempting to comprehend my military achievements represented progress from his earlier dismissal of my potential, but I wasn't sure whether his interest reflected genuine pride in my accomplishments or simply curiosity about developments he felt obligated to acknowledge. Either way, his attendance at the change of command ceremony would provide a definitive test of whether our relationship had evolved beyond the limitations that had defined it throughout my childhood and early adulthood. The 6 months of preparation for command flew by with congressional testimony, transition briefings, and extensive meetings with senior officers who would be evaluating my performance as a battalion commander. The responsibility was daunting but also energizing, representing the culmination of everything I had worked toward since enlisting in the Army 8 years earlier as a young woman determined to prove her father's assessment of her limitations wrong. The change of command ceremony was scheduled for a Thursday morning in May, with General Hayes flying from Washington to personally preside over the transfer of authority and the formal recognition of my appointment to command the 52nd Ordnance Disposal Battalion. The event would be held on the parade field at Fort Campbell, with full military pageantry and an audience of military personnel, family members, and distinguished civilian guests. Marcus arrived 2 days early with our aunt and uncle from Cincinnati, along with Miss Peterson and 3 other neighbors from Millbrook, who had supported my military ambitions when my own father had dismissed them as unrealistic dreams. Their presence meant more to me than any official recognition could have, representing the kind of community support that had sustained me through challenging periods when self-doubt might have undermined my determination to succeed. The morning of the ceremony, I stood in my quarters adjusting my dress uniform and thinking about the journey that had brought me from Frank Romano's auto shop to command of one of the Army's most elite units. The Bronze Star ribbon on my chest represented combat leadership under the most demanding conditions imaginable, while the Lieutenant Colonel insignia on my shoulders indicated trust from senior military leadership that extended far beyond what I had dared hope for when I first enlisted. A knock on my door interrupted my preparations, and I opened it to find Marcus standing in the hallway with an expression I couldn't immediately interpret. Behind him stood Frank Romano, wearing the same borrowed suit he'd worn to my Bronze Star ceremony but carrying himself with less of the awkward uncertainty that had characterized his previous attendance at my military event. "Hi Val," Frank said, meeting my eyes directly for perhaps the first time since I'd left for basic training. "Marcus thought I should come early so we could talk before the ceremony. If you have time, that is." The request was unprecedented in our relationship, representing an initiative on his part to engage with my achievements rather than simply observing them from emotional distance. I invited them both into my quarters, uncertain what Frank wanted to discuss but willing to give him the opportunity he seemed to be requesting. "I've been thinking a lot about things I said to you 8 years ago," he began, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed these words but wasn't confident about their reception. "About the Army not wanting someone like you, about you not being built for military service. I was wrong about all of that, and I owe you an apology." The admission represented more emotional honesty than I had ever heard from my father, acknowledging not just factual errors in his assessment, but the underlying prejudices and limitations that had shaped his understanding of what his daughter might be capable of achieving. It was the conversation I had imagined having with him dozens of times over the years, but now that it was actually happening, I found myself struggling to respond appropriately. "Frank, you were protecting me from disappointment in the only way you knew how," I replied, using his first name as I had since childhood, but with less of the defensive edge that had characterized our previous interaction. "You couldn't have known that the military would become everything I never realized I was looking for. That's just it though," he continued, leaning forward with an intensity I had never associated with discussions of my career or achievements. "I should have known. Your mother saw it, Marcus saw it. Hell, half the neighborhood saw it. You were always the kid who figured out how things worked, who didn't give up when problems got complicated, who wanted to fix whatever was broke. I just couldn't see past my own fears about what might happen if you tried and failed." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Frank explaining how he had followed my military career through newspaper articles, online searches, and conversations with neighbors who had maintained contact with my achievement. He had attended my Bronze Star ceremony, not out of obligation but out of genuine desire to understand what his daughter had accomplished and to acknowledge his role in nearly preventing it from happening. "I'm proud of you, Valerie," he said finally, using words I had waited my entire life to hear. "Not because of the rank or the medals, but because you became exactly who your mother always said you could become. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that." An hour later, I stood on the parade field at Fort Campbell as General Hayes approached the podium to begin the change of command ceremony. The assembled audience included hundreds of soldiers from my new battalion, distinguished military guests, and family members, whose presence represented different aspects of my life and career. In the front row sat Marcus, Frank, and the neighbors from Millbrook, who had never doubted my potential even when I had doubted it myself. General Hayes began her remarks by outlining my qualifications for battalion command, citing my combat leadership in Afghanistan, my contributions to Army doctrine development during my Pentagon assignment, and the recommendations from senior officers who had observed my performance under the most demanding conditions. Her words carried the authority of someone who had risen to the highest levels of military leadership through similar demonstration of competence and dedication. "Lieutenant Colonel Romano represents the very best of Army leadership," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the parade field. "Her technical expertise, combat experience, and commitment to soldier welfare have earned her the respect of peers and superiors throughout her career. But more importantly, she has demonstrated the kind of principled leadership that inspires others to achieve excellence they never thought possible." As she concluded her remarks and turned to administer the oath that would formally transfer command authority to me, General Hayes caught my eye and offered the slightest suggestion of a smile that acknowledged everything we had discussed about career development, leadership philosophy, and the importance of proving that competence transcends traditional expectations about who belongs in positions of authority and responsibility. I repeated the oath with complete understanding of its implications, accepting responsibility for the lives and welfare of soldiers whose achievements would ultimately define the success or failure of my command. The words carried weight that extended far beyond ceremonial significance, representing a culmination of years of preparation and a beginning of challenges that would test every leadership skill I had developed throughout my military career. When the ceremony concluded with the traditional passing of the unit colors and my first salute as battalion commander, General Hayes approached me with the formal bearing that military protocol required, but also with the personal warmth that had characterized our professional relationship over several years. "Congratulations, Colonel Romano," she said, extending her hand with the firm grip that had become her trademark. "Your soldiers are fortunate to have a commander whose experience and judgment have been tested under the most demanding conditions. I have complete confidence in your ability to lead them effectively." Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone present, including myself, General Hayes stepped back and rendered a slow, deliberate salute that acknowledged not just my new rank and position, but everything I had accomplished to earn them. The salute lasted several seconds longer than military protocol required, transforming a routine ceremonial gesture into a moment of recognition that would resonate throughout my career. As I returned her salute, I glanced toward the audience and saw Frank Romano watching with an expression I had never seen before. His weathered face showed something that might have been wonder,
as if he was finally understanding what his daughter had become, and what he had almost prevented through his inability to see past his own limitations and fear. After the ceremony, as family and friends gathered for the reception, Frank approached me with the same hesitant manner he had shown earlier, but with something approaching confidence in his bearing. "Valerie, I saw that generals salute you," he said, his voice carrying amazement that made him sound like the father I had always hoped he could become. "That wasn't just protocol, was it? That was real respect from someone who's seen everything and knows what matters." "Yes, Frank," I replied, understanding that this moment represented the resolution of conflicts that had shaped both of our lives for far too long. "That was real respect, earned through years of proving that your daughter was never the limitation you thought she was." He nodded slowly, processing implications that extended beyond this single ceremony to encompass everything he had missed about my potential and achievements. "I'm going to do better," he said quietly. "I want to understand what you've built here, what it means to the soldiers you're commanding, what it took to get here. If you'll let me." The conversation marked the beginning of a relationship we had never managed to develop during my childhood, based on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's lives rather than disappointment and unfulfilled expectation. Frank Romano had finally understood that his daughter's success wasn't a rejection of his values, but a fulfillment of potential he had been too afraid to recognize. 6 months later, Frank attended my first battalion awards ceremony, watching with obvious pride as I presented decorations to soldiers whose achievements reflected the unit's evolution under my command. During the reception afterward, several of my soldiers approached him to express their respect for my leadership and their appreciation for the way I had developed their capabilities while prioritizing their welfare and professional development. "Your daughter is the kind of officer we've been hoping to serve under our entire careers," Staff Sergeant Martinez told him, the same NCO who had served with me in Alpha Platoon years earlier, and had requested assignment to my new battalion. "She makes us want to be better soldiers because we know she believes in our potential even when we don't believe in it ourselves." Frank listened to these comments with the kind of attention he had never paid to descriptions of my achievement, finally understanding that his daughter's success was measured not just in rank and decorations, but in the lives she had influenced, and the standards she had established for military excellence. The girl he had dismissed as unrealistic was now shaping the careers of soldiers who would carry her leadership lessons throughout their own military service. That evening, as we sat in my quarters sharing a beer and talking about his plans to expand the auto shop into a full-service garage, Frank raised a topic that surprised me with its directness and emotional honesty. "I need you to know that your mother would be proud of everything you've accomplished," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years of regret about opportunities missed and support not provided. "She always said you were going to do something extraordinary, and she was right about that, like she was right about most things. I should have listened to her instead of letting my fears make decisions for our family." The acknowledgement meant more to me than any military decoration or promotion could have, representing recognition from the person whose approval I had sought throughout my childhood, and whose skepticism had driven much of my determination to succeed. Frank Romano had finally become the father I had always needed him to be, and I had become the daughter he was finally able to appreciate. 2 years later, when I was selected for promotion to full colonel and assignment as the commanding officer of the Army's Explosive Ordnance Disposal School, Frank was in the front row of the promotion ceremony, wearing a suit he had purchased specifically for the occasion, and beaming with the kind of unconditional pride that had taken us both decades to achieve. The mechanic's daughter, who had been told she'd never amount to anything, had become one of the Army's most respected EOD officers, leading the institution responsible for training every explosive ordnance disposal technician in the military. But more important, she had finally earned her father's understanding and respect, proving that limitations exist primarily in the minds of those who accept them as permanent, rather than challenges to be overcome through determination, competence, and unwavering commitment to becoming everything you're capable of being. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.